First of all, thanks, Megan, for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'll probably wander around a little bit in the presentation, but sit down to take your questions on the chin at the end of it. First, let me start by explaining my subtitle. I'm not going to give you a potted history of all of Foucault's work. That's beyond my abilities. I've engaged with Foucault's work from the point of view of what my interests are in the relationships between culture and society. So what I'm going to do is to try to give you a summary of Foucault's perspectives on the relationships between knowledge and power, to talk about how those perspectives of his conception of the relations between knowledge and power have been translated by some, including myself, into the analysis of culture-society relationships. So to formalise that a little bit, then I'm just going to take two of Foucault's key concepts, knowledge and power, show how these inform related concepts in his work, specifically the politics of truth, his conception of the politics of truth, and the implications of his conception of the politics of truth for intellectual practice, and the implication of his conceptions of the relations between knowledge and power for how he suggested we should approach the analysis of the operations of institutions, or as he called them, apparatuses or dispositifs, particularly with regard to processes of subjectification. I'm also going to try and place these aspects of his work in an appropriate historical and theoretical setting by discussing what these concepts were developed against, and in particular, the ways in which they were pitched against prevailing Marxist conceptions of the relations between science and ideology in the 60s and 70s. I'm going to say a little bit about how his contentions in these regards informed a resistance to incorporating Foucault's work into the concerns of British cultural studies in the 1960s and 1970s. And I'll make some connections with issues that Ian was talking about last week in relationship to Stuart Hall. But there are other reasons why Foucault's conception of knowledge-power relationships were not initially readily applied to the study of culture-society relationships. Foucault's own concerns, this is just a potted summary of some of his key studies, were very much with knowledge-power relationships focused on disciplines like medicine, psychology, psychiatry, criminology, and the natural and biological sciences. He was concerned with how these disciplines were put to work in the governance of conduct in enclosed institutions like hospitals, prisons, and asylums. He had little explicitly to say about culture, apart from some things he wrote about painting and aesthetics, but culture as a concept wasn't something that he engaged with much, something I'll come back to. So people interested in thinking about how Foucault's conceptions of the relations between knowledge and power might be brought to bear upon the analysis of the relations between culture and society have had to think through the implications of his concept for the cultural disciplines, for disciplines like aesthetics, anthropology, art history, and history. And this has been work in which Australian scholarship has figured strongly. And I'm going to illustrate some of my presentation with reference to Australian scholarship, including a couple of projects that have been conducted within the Institute for Culture and Society. One on museums and colonialism, which is now finished, one which is ongoing under the title of Assembling and Governing Habits. So that's a rough overview of what I'm going to be dealing with. But first let me go back a step, and in fact 50 years, to give a sense of why Foucault's bringing together knowledge and power and speaking of these as productively interconnected, as allies rather than as contraries, was so innovative in the context of the debates in the late 60s and early 70s, and to outline its main consequences. What I'm showing here is a picture rather, painted by a radical artistic collective led by the artist Gilles Ayode, from whose perspective Louis Althusser, the leading French Marxist theorist of the 60s and 70s and a member of the French Communist Party, had sat on the sidelines during the political events of 1968. Althusser is the shadowy figure here, shown crossing the threshold into what is Claude Lévi-Strauss's country retreat. Claude Lévi-Strauss, the leader of French structuralist anthropology, is shown sitting in the chair there. This is Lacan, Jacques Lacan, the radical psychiatric theorist of the period. This is Roland Barthes, the author of Mythologies, cultural critic, shown serving petit foie. And this is Michel Foucault, shown scratching his head abstractedly in the foreground. The political point of the painting is these are all depicted as intellectuals who were somewhat abstracted from, who had sat on the sidelines of the struggles of 1968. I came across this in a 1998 50th anniversary exhibition of 1968 at the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and it reminded me of three things. First, it reminded me that 1968 was the year in which I first became acquainted with the name and the work of Michel Foucault, when I was a higher degree research student. Yes, I was, I promise you. I was a higher degree research student at the University of Sussex. That's when I first encountered him. And his work was immediately distinctive and challenging. Second, seeing this reminded me on how far his work has succeeded in displacing some of the assumptions on which the perspective of this painting is based. The critique of the intellectuals for standing to the side of what was depicted as in 1968, just one field of struggle, one field of power. And them intellectuals having stood to the side of it. And third, the respects in which in disputing this perspective and advancing his conception of a politics of truth, much of Foucault's work was, albeit implicitly rather than explicitly, directed against Louis Althusser. So let me just briefly summarize the perspective of Louis Althusser's very influential Ideological State Apparatuses essay. Have you heard of this? Yeah? Okay. For Althusser, a truth-falsehood polarity informed the distinction between Marxist science and bourgeois ideology. Such ideology, bourgeois ideology, was said to be relayed by what he called ideological state apparatuses. Calling these apparatuses state apparatuses meant that he interpreted the state as the locus for the exercise of a singular form of power derived from the ownership of capital. Marx's conception of the state as the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. And he interpreted ideology as a form of subjectification, which he interpreted as working through an invariant mechanism of the subject, which he called interpellation. That of the mechanism of interpellation through which individuals are, as he put it, called in to occupy the subject positions that dominant ideologies construct for them as national subjects, for example, and that stitch them into identifications that work in favour of a state dominated by the interests of capital. Schools, churches, the media, these were all Althusser's ideological state apparatuses, and they all work through the mechanism of interpellation. From the early 1970s, Foucault, writing a number of short pieces and interviews, generalizing out from his work on the histories of medicine, psychology, and criminology, did so in order to oppose a politics of the truth based upon a polarity between the conceptions of science and ideology, and to elaborate its implications for the politics of intellectual work. So this is an excerpt from one of his essays from his essay Truth and Power, a series of excerpts with my interpolations. Truth, he says, is a system of ordered procedures for the production, regulation, distribution, circulation and operation of statements, linked in a circular relation with systems of power which produce and sustain it, the effects of power which induce and extend it. Truth and power are brought together inextricably. The political task such regimes of truth pose for intellectuals is not one of ideology critique, not criticizing ideology in the name of the truth of science, but that of ascertaining the possibility of constituting a new politics of truth. The problem, he said, is not changing people's consciousness, what's in their heads, but the political, economic and institutional regime of the production of truth. Truth, he says, is not to be emancipated from power. Rather, its detachment from prevailing hegemonies is to serve as a prelude for the production of new regimes of truth with their own distinctive power effects. There's no power-free realm of truth for Foucault. Such is the task to which Foucault summons specific intellectuals, urging that they eschew the illusory embrace of a truth and politics beyond power that had beckoned what he called the universal intellectual. The intellectual politics represented by the last point on this PowerPoint were a part of Foucault's broader project of what he called cutting off the king's head in political theory. In place of organising a totalising form of opposition to a totalised form of power, for Foucault, the place accorded capital in Marxist thought was just another version of sovereign power, of the place accorded the king in systems of sovereignty. Rather than, in place of organising a totalising form of opposition to a totalised form of power, the project that Foucault proposed was one of taking issue with existing specific power-knowledge combinations relayed via specific apparatuses in order to propose counter-knowledges that would have a role in the shaping of counter-conducts. In the 1960s and 1970s, in Anglophone debates, which is the ones I was familiar with, the positive take-up of Michel Foucault's work was initially by people working on the history of the psychological disciplines, notably Nicholas Rose, in the UK at any rate. The reception of Foucault's work in cultural studies was quite different and initially a lot more hesitant. Now, I don't know whether Ian Ang talked about this last week, but there are some connections to be made here between Foucault's work and the opposition to it that came from Stuart Hall and the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies more generally, for a period, not forever. In the 60s and 70s, the work of the Birmingham School, and of Stuart Hall in particular, was defined by bringing aspects of Althusser's work into a somewhat uneasy alliance with the Gramscian theory of hegemony, producing a politics focused around an opposition between the subordinate class and the power bloc, in which the key issues for Hall and the Birmingham School concerned a political struggle to produce organic intellectuals who would use the principles of Marxist science to mobilize the popular classes against the ideologies of the power bloc. So, the sticking point for Stuart Hall when he engaged with the work of Michel Foucault, and you can see this in his very famous essay, Cultural Studies, Two Paradigms, was the breaking down of a primary axis of struggle organised around a knowledge versus power axis into a dispersed set of field of knowledge-power relations, each producing their own distinctive fields of politics. What troubled Hall was foregoing the historic task of the organic intellectual in favour of the more particular fields of contestation that informed Michel Foucault's conception of the role of the specific intellectual. The specific intellectual took issue with specific regimes of knowledge and power and their operation, rather than a universal totalizing knowledge versus power opposition. In addition to the points that I've made, Foucault also pluralized power-knowledge relations in different ways by pluralizing power historically. He brought a great deal of theoretical attention to the concept of power, and rather than accepting it having a singular form, he broke it down into a number of different historical forms, although he was always clear to argue that these historical forms of power did not succeed one another. Earlier forms continued to exist into the present. And I want to talk about these briefly because cultural practices, which is what I'll come to shortly, play a different role within these different regimes of power. Pastoral power refers to the power of the Christian pastorate in post-classical and medieval Europe, in which the main ways in which culture is operative within power relations has to do with the use of religious imagery in the organisation of a shepherd-flock relationship between the pastorate, the priesthood, and the congregation. The shepherd leading the congregation as a shepherd does a flock. And of course the role of biblical texts and sermons within the organisation of such relationships. Sovereign power was the form of power that Foucault used to refer to the absolutist monarchies of Western Europe, in which there were two main aspects to the politics of culture. First was the use of culture by the state, by the sovereign, particularly through court dramas, ballets, operas and so on, to bind the aristocracy into relationships of dependency on the monarch. The second was a politics of spectacle directed to the population at large, in which, and one of the distinctive things that Foucault had to say about this was the politics of spectacle did not concern itself in the least with making use of the attitudes, opinions and ways of doing things of those subjects it addressed in a purely passive mode. So the politics of spectacle sought to impress power upon the subjects. The politics of spectacle addressed the people as people who might be impressed standing outside the Louvre by the magnificence of Palace, but who were never allowed to enter into it to engage with the kind of court politics of art and nobility. There was no intent to make use of the attitudes, opinions and ways of doing things of the population at large. Police is a system of power that Foucault referred to, used to refer to raison d'etat, the reasons of state as a principle of power that was, as it were, abstracted from the figure of the sovereign. Police and the raison d'etat do take account of attitudes, opinions, ways of doing things, but they do so it does so in a restricted way by linking these to particular occupations, seeking to cultivate in those who occupy particular occupations only the skills and resources and capacities that are necessary for the members of those occupations to contribute to the organisation of population as a national resource, trained to meet a national resource for the state. This resulted in transitional forms of the administration of culture as a mechanism for the cultivation of moral codes appropriate to the occupants of different but particular occupations. Governmental power is a form of power that plays a key role in Foucault's conception, his criticisms of statist conceptions of power. In his essay, very famous essay on governmentality, governmental power, which he argued arises in Europe in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, replaces sovereignty, replaces the principle of the sovereign as a singular form of power focused on the monarchy. Governmental power is associated with the development of a multiplicity of knowledge-power relationships, each of which is characterized by distinctive governmental rationalities, distinctive ways of seeking to shape the conduct of different sections of the population toward the pursuit of different ends. As such, governmental power works through both the manipulation of milieus, that's to say the conditions of life, and, unlike sovereign power, governmental power is acutely concerned with the attitudes, opinions, ways of doing things, habits, beliefs and customs of the population at large. Within Foucault's conception of governmentality, he also pays particular attention to what he calls liberal government, which is not the same thing as liberalism. Rather, for Foucault, liberal government refers to a distinctive set of mechanisms through which particular, usually elite social strata, govern themselves through the mechanism of freedom. Freedom here is not to be understood as something that is given, but rather for Foucault, freedom is something that is made up through the operation of particular knowledges and apparatuses which individuals deploy to work upon themselves through various technologies of the self. And he saw, as I'll come back to this point, a key role for aesthetic disciplines in this regard. Biopower, finally, is a form of anatomopolitics. It's a form of power that works on the administration of bodies in social space through the divisions, chiefly through the divisions it produces between racialized bodies. And biopower has had a critical role to play in the development of colonial forms of administration. Okay, so that's a brief laying out of some of the distinctive aspects of the conceptual apparatus of Michel Foucault's work. I'm interested in the rest of this presentation about trying to show what it means to work with Foucault, how to deploy his concepts, how to apply them to particular empirical instances concerned with the culture-society relationship. And I'm going to do so by focusing upon governmental power, mainly on governmental power. But before I do so, I just want to say that this concept of governmentality had a particularly marked and strong influence on debates in cultural studies and adjacent fields in Australia in the late 70s and early 80s. It did so really prior to its doing so in any other Anglophone context. This was partly because of the attention accorded to Foucault's work in a more sympathetic way by scholars like Meagher Morris, for example, who embraced Foucault quite early on. But it also had to do with the influence that Foucault's essay on governmentality, translated into English in 1991, had on a flurry of work produced in Australia in the 80s and 90s. I'll just say one or two things about each of these. Ian Hunter's Culture and Government was a particularly important text published before the English translation of Foucault's essay on governmentality, bringing culture and government together. This was a very contentious thing to do because in cultural studies debates at the time, culture was paired with resistance. Culture and resistance to power. Culture and government was seen as an odd combination. Bringing culture and government together in his historical analysis of the role that post-Kantian and romantic aesthetic theory played in the broader social processes of social governance when brought to bear upon the development of popular schooling in Britain via a distinctive stratum of aesthetically trained school administrators, public administrators. The collection by Mitchell Dean and Barry Hindus is on varied topics, including questions of cultural governments, questions focused on education, on indigenous governments, on sexual harassment in the army was a very important and influential early collection. Tim Rouse's work, a member of the Institute, of course, important in pointing to the development of what he called a new governmental domain for the administration of Indigenous Australians in the immediate pre- and post-Federation periods. And in my book there, Culture, a Reform of Science, I took some of Foucault's knowledge power perspectives and brought these to bear upon some debates that were current within cultural studies at the time, taking issue, for example, with Adorno's opposition of art and administration, taking issue with the politics of resistance in some of its formulations, and offering a genealogy of the key cultural studies concept of culture as a way of life that took issue with its more conventional interpretations, and I'll come back on that. And these issues, originally explored in Australian debates, were taken up by a number of theorists in a little later on. So this is just by way of giving you some background as to when and where in Anglophone debates the perspectives of knowledge and power were first applied to cultural studies, culture, society debates. To explore some of the logics involved in these debates, I want to draw upon the work of Dean and Rose, both of whom I've referred to get across three key aspects of Foucault's concept. First, the perspective of governmentality. Any more or less calculated or rational activity undertaken by a multiplicity of authorities and agencies employing a variety of techniques and forms of knowledge that seek to shape our conduct by working through our desires that are to definite and specific ends and outcomes. Next thing is the mechanism of subjectification from Nicholas Rose. Foucault's work was crucial in taking debates about subjectification away from the influence of debates stemming from semiotics and what was called the cultural turn, in which culture was seen as a set of language-like set of systems of meaning working on consciousness, but abstractly, through the ether, as it were, upon each of us directly. In lieu of this, Nicholas Rose is saying its subjectification is not to be understood by locating it in a universe of meaning, but in a complex of apparatuses, practices, machinations, and assemblages within which the human being has been fabricated and which presuppose and enjoin particular relations with ourselves. We don't understand how we're made as subjects through the abstract operation of language or systems of meaning. We have to look at how we're worked upon through particular technological assemblages. Particularly the role of knowledge being translated into forms of expertise. Again from Nicholas Rose, when we're talking about knowledge practices, practically speaking, these become translated into the role of experts in particular, operating in particular apparatuses. I want now for most of the time that remains to illustrate these perspectives via 3 case studies. But before I come to the case studies, I want to make 2 more general points. First, I've said that Foucault didn't have much to say about culture, and he didn't. But he did once say something about it in this lecture course, Hermeneutics of the Subject, where he says there are 4 conditions for speaking about culture. First, there has to be a set of values with a minimum degree of coordination, subordination, and hierarchy. Second, these values have to be given both as universal but also as only accessible to a few, so as to produce a mechanism of selection and exclusion. Third, a number of precise and regular forms of conduct are necessary for individuals to be able to reach these values. Now, up until this point in time, it might have been Pierre Bourdieu speaking. But fourth, and critically, the techniques for acquiring those values have to be taught, transmitted, and validated as parts of the operation of a field of knowledge. And this is what Thomas Osborne, one of the scholars whose work I had up a couple of slides back, refers to as the veridical twist that Foucault gives to the concept of culture. He gives it a truth turn twist. And in the same study, but at some length, so you're going to have to settle for my summary of it, a summary derived from this book, in which he makes a general argument that I think is of great relevance to the analysis of culture-society relations, and it's his perspective of transactional realities, which he develops in relationship to the conception of civil society. So from my summary of it here, I say that Foucault disputes the conception of civil society as a primary and immediate given, or as an ahistorical natural given, which functions in some way as both the foundation of and source of opposition to the state or political institutions. This is the conception of civil society as it's used in contract theory as a foundation for the modern bourgeois political order. It is rather, he says, civil society is rather a product of modern governmental technologies that operates as a transactional reality. That is, it is a historically novel interface in the relations between governors and governed. The first key point here is that practices of government never work, that I want to generate out from this, practices of governance for Foucault never work on populations directly as something pre-given to those practices of governance, as if in a raw natural state, so to speak. Rather, practices of government work through the ways in which populations, individuals, groups, and the relations between them have been given a certain form, have been worked up in a particular way by the knowledge practices which produce the particular mediating concepts, the transactional realities, through which their conduct is connected with and acted on in specific ways via the technologies that circulate those knowledges and the forms of expertise that translate them into practice. But the second implication of this conception is that varied forms of engagement with such governing practices that work on us through transactional realities, we also work with and against the forms of power that operate on us through transactional realities through those transactional realities. The transactional realities mediate the relations, the two-way sets of relations between governors and governed. All right, I'm going to now turn to 3 case studies to try to illustrate these perspectives. The first is focused on the relations between aesthetics, social governance, and the development of public art galleries in 19th century Britain. And I'm going to be particularly concerned here to illustrate the concept that I put up earlier of governmental rationalities. The second case study is I'm going to look at how the history of anthropology, and particularly the role of American anthropology in producing what's since come to be known as the anthropological concept of culture, the concept of culture as a way of life, which got translated into cultural studies through the work of Raymond Williams. I want to show how this role of anthropology in producing the concept of cultures of ways of life anchored to particular culture areas, particular regions, particular territories, have come together with indigenous knowledges in contemporary museum uses in Australia of mapping projects which have provided a productive technological mediation of the relations between Western and indigenous knowledges of the connections between culture and country. And the third thing that I want to talk about is working from a project I'm working on with a number of colleagues in the Institute on habit, is looking at how discourses of habit and the technologies through which habit is translated into governing practices have differentiated populations for the purposes of governance, addressing some groups as capable of using habit as a mechanism of free self-governance and self-development, while in other cases subordinating particular populations to the mechanisms to colonial forms of biopower. Okay. So the first study is, my heading for it is the art gallery versus the pub, which I can never really resist as a topic, I have to say. So my first topic is associated with the governmental rationality associated with the development of public art galleries in mid-19th century Britain. Prior to this point in time, with some exceptions, art galleries throughout most of Western Europe were collected mainly by the aristocracy and by royalty, and access to them was restricted. All right? They were elite institutions. In the mid-19th century, museums, art galleries became public. Anyone could go. To understand the governmental rationality that was at work here, we need to look at the interrelationships between two discourses. Mid-19th century discourses of art and aesthetics, and new discourses derived from the work of Malthus regarding the relationships between poverty and individualized responsibility. It's the bringing of these two things together that made it rational to think of opening up public art galleries to the population as a way of working upon specific aspects of and changing their conduct. Viewed throughout much of the 17th and 18th centuries as a form of aristocratic diversion, the sphere of art was not at this point in time regarded as a realm possessing any special moral or aesthetic qualities. Under the influence of the German philosophers Kant, Schiller, and later Romanticism, however, the spheres of art came to be, by the late 18th, early 19th centuries, came to be regarded as a special realm providing a set of resources which permitted and promoted various kinds of work on the self, encouraged us to work upon ourselves in various ways, that would result in, it was argued, the harmonization of the individual's personality. The fusion of these ideas with late 18th and early 19th century culture of sensibility, it doesn't matter what that is, led to the view that frequent contact, not for our purposes here anyway, led to the view that frequent contact with art would result in more refined codes of personal conduct and a capacity for individualized forms of self-inspection and regulation. But this was felt in the 18th century, these were capacities that only the propertied classes who counted as citizens could possess and cultivate. It was only the coming together of such conceptions about what art and aesthetics might accomplish in terms of producing new interiorized forms of self-reflection that would lead us to change our codes of behavior. It's the bringing together of such conceptions with new ways of thinking about the population that made it intelligible to expect in the mid-19th century that general benefits might follow from culture's more extended distribution, from making culture available to the population as a whole. And in the English context, changes in the administration of the poor law were crucial here. In England in the 18th century, the forms of poor law administration that were current rested on a conception of the population as a resource to be managed for the benefit of the national wealth. The poor laws accordingly sought to set the poor to work so that in providing for their own sustenance, they might increase the wealth and strength of the nation. It's kind of like the Morrison government before the Morrison government, really. But this system exhorted the poor to engage in an industrious course of life, but it did not aspire to have them choose such a course of life. It was something they had to be forced to do. It didn't require them to choose an industrious course of life as a matter of personal responsibility or self-regulation. While 18th century forms of poor relief had been accompanied by attacks on popular recreations, and especially alehouses, these attacks sought simply to outlaw such recreations because of the fear that the slothfulness and drunkenness to which they gave rise might lead to a wastage of the national resource of population. People would die away and there'd be no use anymore, or they'd be idle, drunk, and what have you. But such campaigns aimed simply at transforming the idle poor into an industrious poor, but without such a transformation proceeding through or being dependent upon any inner mechanism of moral or inner self-transformation. By contrast, the work of Thomas Malthus, the early 19th century population theorist, and his conception of the need for moral restraint in conjugal relationships as a check to the threat of overpopulation, led to a new conception of the poor, which made it intelligible to think of art and culture as resources that might be enlisted in the cause of governing through the moral transformation, the inner moral transformation of the working man. Just the working man, not the working woman, for reasons I'll come to. This was the signature of the 1834 Poor Law, which made poor relief dependent upon moral demeanour. It hadn't before. If the 18th century posed the workhouse as a disciplinary alternative to the alehouse, the 19th century placed the museum and gallery between the two and assigned the task of producing the worker who would not only not frequent the public house, but crucially, would no longer wish to do so, and would also voluntarily practice moral restraint in his conjugal relationships with his wife. The male was regarded as the sole initiator of conjugal relationships. It's thus a fairly constant trope in the literature of cultural reform, evident from the 1830s to the 1880s, to find the art gallery, and sometimes the library, but specifically the art gallery, ranged against the public house as an agent deemed capable of transforming the working man into a new self-regulating moral subject. The stress that was placed on art's role in helping form a working man who would not want to drink was a stress not just for its own sake, but also because this was viewed as a means of developing capacities that would make the working man want to save, want to practice sexual restraint, and want to work. And this stress on changing the conduct of the working man placed great emphasis on doing so via the work of art through his free activity. This wasn't something that was to be forced upon the working man. It was something that was in accordance with the spreading currents of 19th century liberalism. It had to respect the freedom and autonomy of the working man. It could not interfere with the freedom of the working man by forcing him not to drink. It had to persuade him not to want to drink. And only in this way, it was argued, could the position of women and children be improved, because they would no longer be subject to male battery. Times haven't always changed. We see these concerns in the reasons for advocating public art galleries. I address these issues in that collection of essays, in one of the essays in it, by Sir Henry Cole. Sir Henry Cole was one of the key proponents of advocating the opening of art galleries to the public in the mid-19th century. He was the leading public administrator behind the Great Exhibition of 1851, and he was the founding director of the South Kensington Museum, which is today's Victoria and Albert Museum. He places great stress here upon it not being possible to interfere with the conduct of the working man by interfering with his liberty. I have little hope for the class of people 40 years of age that lay on straw drunk. I do not know what can be done with them, but if I were potent enough, I would take from their wages something for their wives and children before they had spent all, though that would be interfering with the liberty of the subject. Instead, Cole recognises that such interference with the liberty of the subject is not possible in terms of the codes of liberalism. So, in lieu of that, he advocated making every place more attractive than the public house, and to encourage the feeling of responsibility among all classes that it is a disgrace to get drunk, even in a public house. And so we find quite often in the literature of the period, we find scenes of the pub of this kind being contrasted to scenes of the gallery. in which the working class are admitted, receiving guidance from the regular top-hatted middle-class public of the galleries, and inculcating the lessons of art and culture, refining their sensibilities in ways that would make them transformed moral subjects. As one observer put it, the anxious wife will no longer have to visit the different tap rooms to drag her poor, besotted husband home. She will seek for him at the nearest museum, where she will have to exercise all the persuasion of her affection to tear him away from the rapt contemplation of a Raphael. So this is the governmental rationality. It doesn't work now, but it worked then, okay? So we've got a particular set of knowledges, aesthetics, art history, being deployed within a specific institutional context, a specific apparatus, the art gallery, in order to bring about calculated changes in the calculated changes in the conduct of a specifically targeted population, the working man. So this case provides an example of how a specific cultural knowledge, aesthetics, came through the forms of expertise represented by art gallery curators and directors and their role in mobilizing aesthetics in the arrangement of art galleries to constitute a transactional reality, something for operating upon the conduct of the working man. A second example focuses on the role of anthropology as a cultural knowledge, as a cultural discipline, and specifically its role in producing the concept of ways of life as another transactional reality, one that's played a key role as a transactional reality for governmental action on the relationships between different cultures. And I'm going to be drawing here upon work conducted for a project, an Institute for Cultural Research project, producing this book, co-authored by myself, Fiona Cameron, Nelia Diaz, Ben Dibley, Fiona and Ben from the Institute, Rodney Harrison, Ira Jackness and Conal McCarthy, excuse me. Now, the concept of culture as a way of life is often regarded as one of the key foundational concepts of cultural studies through its influence on the work of Raymond Williams. But it has a longer history, and one which Raymond Williams recognised in acknowledging the indebtedness of his related concept of structure of feeling, that is, his contention that different ways of life have distinctive structures of feeling. He acknowledged the indebtedness of his concept of structure of feeling to the work of Ruth Benedict. Ruth Benedict was an early to mid-20th century American anthropologist, famous, among other things, for her contention that the cultures or ways of life of different Native American peoples each had a distinctive pattern. She wrote a book called The Pattern of Culture, The Patterns of Culture. This pattern, she argued, was shaped like the aesthetic structure of a work of art, and this pattern was shaped by the interactions between the people concerned and the particular territory they occupied. Ruth Benedict's work was part of a larger school of American anthropology, tremendously influential, led by Franz Boas. A school of anthropology that was noted for detaching anthropology from the early assumptions of evolutionary thought, post-Darwin evolutionary thought that had characterized its late 19th century forms, contesting those and interpreting indigenous cultures as being, like any other culture, distinctive adaptations to territorially marked shaping environments. So to illustrate this concept of way of life, this is a very famous museum exhibition organized by Franz Boas when he was the curator of anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History in 1902. And the point about this is this shows cedar bark being shredded and hung to dry, the implements needed for the shredding operation, the repair of the fishing nets, salmon baskets are portrayed in the background, a young child in a hanging cradle with cedar bark bedding is depicted, the weave on the woman's blankets is shown, decorative ankle bracelets are around the mannequins, there's a gender division of labour between the woman shredding the cedar bark and the man beating it, the placing of the child next to the women and at some distance from the man. In these ways, and this was a marked break with earlier anthropological exhibitions which displayed things like tools and technologies in an evolutionary sequence, in these ways, the relations between the artifacts and the mannequins that are brought together in this display cabinet integrate the artifacts into specific uses that evoke a particular way of life with its distinctive internal divisions, patterns and forms that's depicted as being an adaptation to a specific environment. This concept of culture as ways of life had some immediate impact upon ways of thinking about governing in American social and political thought in the early 20th century. John Dewey, very influential early 20th century political theorist, and who was a colleague of Franz Boas, is at Columbia University when Boas left the American Museum of Natural History to join Columbia University, spoke about the ways in which the anthropological concept of culture as a way of life influenced his conception of governing in ways that invoke the concept of culture as a way of life as a transactional reality. Not a term he used, a term I used, but I think it works. So in his book Freedom and Culture, Dewey rethinks the relations between government and freedom in the light of recent discoveries in the field of anthropology, which he said provided sufficient proof of the notion that the problem can be stated, sufficient disproof of the notion that the problem can be stated as one of the relation of the individual and the social, as if these names stood for actual existences. In their place, he says, anthropology substitutes culture, which relativizes forms of individuality by interpreting them as the outcomes of the patterns of behavior that mark out the activities of any group, family, clan, people, section, faction, class. Culture is the mediating surface, this is me, through which government, guided by science, shapes passions, desires and interests by acting not upon individuals, but indirectly acting on individuals through their incorporation within culture. And long before it entered into the vocabulary of cultural studies, this concept of culture as a way of life had a long career as a key governmental actor in post-1920s development of assimilationist policies directed toward the US's migrant populations. But it's the concept's governmental career in Australia that I'm most interested in, and particularly how, in connection with Indigenous knowledges of country, it has helped to shape this, the 1996 map produced by the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. This map has quite a complicated history, and the bad news is I'm going to tell you some of it. The result of a research project organised by ATSIS to map all language, nation and tribal groups of Aboriginal Australia, this map has its conceptual roots in the longer history of mapping projects that spatialise the relations between different Aboriginal groups by territorialising them. While not without precedence, the key figure in this process of what one historian has tellingly called laying down the country or reducing the country to order was Norman Tyndale, a curator at the Museum of South Australia, at the South Australian Museum, whose map showing the distribution of the Aboriginal tribes of Australia was a game changer in this regard. You can't really see it clearly on this map, but the map is intersected by a number of lines which demarcate different language, culture areas of Aboriginal Australia. Although not published in its final form until 1974, this map was the result of research stretching back to the start of the 1930s, with the first version of the map being published in 1940. Its significance in the assessment of Philip Jones, who currently occupies the position that Tyndale once occupied as head of anthropology at the South Australian Museum, its significance was that of demonstrating, and I quote, that Aboriginal groups did relate territorially to distinct regions that could be successfully mapped, end of quote. But in saying this, Jones acknowledged that Tyndall's mapping project owed a considerable debt to the American tradition of anthropology associated with Franz Boas, particularly via Tyndall's professional association with Clark Whistler. Clark Whistler was one of Boas's PhD students and succeeded him as curator of anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History. And curator was particularly known for bringing together the concept of culture as a way of life with the concept of culture area, a distinctive territory, and for translating this concept of culture area into mapping projects, mapping of culture to country. This is a map of the Plains Indian culture area produced by Whistler. And Whistler collaborated with Tyndall in his 1930s anthropological projects and was one of the collaborators in Tyndall's production of the mapping of Aboriginal languages and culture to territory. Well, There's a lot more to this history than I have time to go into, except to add that perhaps like many national projects, which this clearly is, Tyndall's map, going back to it, was also an instance of what James Scott calls seeing like a state. This is a map of Australia. It's a map seeing Australia from a state, a totalizing perspective from above. And as such, Tyndall's map was envisaged as an aid to more exact white anthropological research that would assist the settler state in its governance of Aboriginal populations. But be this as it may, indeed precisely because of it, Tyndall's map occupies a key place in the development of Indigenous mapping projects, which, in rebuttal of earlier forms of colonial rule which sought to weaken or erase them, have asserted the strength of differentiated Indigenous connections of culture to country as the basis for recognition and reconciliation. And this brings me back to the Ayatsis map, which is now, or maps like it, widely used in Australian museums to provide a territorial visualisation of Aboriginal languages and culture. This is a map I took while visiting the Cooktown Museum in Cooktown. We have a stylised representation of it that features currently at the National Museum of Australia. And even when this specific map is not in use, and you'll find this map recurring in all sorts of Indigenous projects about culture to country in books, as well as in museums, so on. Even when this specific map is not in use, variants of it inform the curatorial logics of a number of recent special exhibitions, like the National Museum of Australia's 2015-16 Encounters exhibition, where Indigenous objects held in the British Museum are presented as regaining their true meaning only on being exhibited in the context of the specific and different Indigenous countries that they were taken away from. Or the more recent exhibition, Songlines Tracking the Seven Sisters, which shows different country culture variations of the Seven Sisters story. Both exhibitions, jointly curated by Indigenous scholars and anthropologists, with some combining both roles, both expositions brought together Western and Indigenous knowledges in the context of a state institution and a nationalist cartography, the map of Australia, to produce a transactional reality through which the remediation of the relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians is currently being enacted in a host of cultural contexts, and also criticised, as in Indigenous artist Josephine Mick's painting of the Seven Sisters songline, which preceded the Seven Sisters exhibition but was used as the frontispiece to the exhibition, which she presents as a critique of what she calls the Whitefella map. The Seven Sisters, dancing across the continent in flight from their pursuer, asserts a primacy and dominance of Indigenous presence that eclipses their national cartographic framing. The national frame is diluted as a consequence. Or Daniel Boyd's 2005 Treasure Island, which writes over the mapping of culture to country represented by the Ayatsis map, the conception of Australia as a treasure island whose resources are to be exploited for the benefit of all Australians, except, his implied critique is, except its original inhabitants. Mapping culture to country and allocating resources to country, in other words, are two different things. So a specific transactional reality produced by bringing together in a complex way Indigenous and Western knowledges, but that also informs, critiques, counter knowledges, counter practices. A third example is habit, which I've been working on for some time, and now working on together with a team of researchers, mainly from the Institute, but also Nicholas Rose from King's College. A project on assembling and governing habit, and that's how the project is roughly described in the research application to the Australian Research Council. And you can see, I won't read it, there is a clear Foucauldian framing there to the ways in which we set up the notion of habit. But habit, like culture, is not a topic that Foucault had said a great deal about. Indeed, until recently, I was only aware of little bits here and there. But in his recently published 2015 to 2016 book called Punitive Society, which is the text of an early 1970s course of lectures, he ends this, much to my surprise, with a fairly extended discussion of the subject of habit. In his final lecture, this is me summarising Foucault again, he said his purpose had been to offer the very first history of the power of habits, the archaeology of those apparatuses of power that serve as the basis for the acquisition of habit as a social norm, as social norms. And he goes on to say that in the 18th century, in the work of David Hume, the concept of habit was mobilised to criticise conceptions of political order based on traditional obligations. In recasting these traditional obligations as the effect of habit, rather than seeing them as resting on a transcendental authority and thereby weakening the force of traditional obligations, Foucault argues, these 18th century accounts of habit prepared the way for a new conception of social order that will be based upon contractual bonds. This is the theory of the social contract, that were voluntarily entered into by free and independent, in the sense of propertied individuals. So he sees here the 18th century discourses of habit playing a productive role in the foundations of social contract theory and the basis for a new social order that combined, that ordered the relations between the propertied. But he goes on to say, in the 19th century, by contrast, habit becomes a virtue to be acquired by those without property, as what binds them to an apparatus that they do not own, to an order of things, an order of time, and to a political order. It fixes individuals to the production apparatus through a play of coercion and punishment, apprenticeship and chastisement, a process that operates through the permanent function of normalization. And he goes on, these relations between normalization, habit, and discipline give rise to a new form of discourse which dispenses with the symbolic theatrics of sovereign power and gives way to the discourse of the master, of he who supervises, states the norm, makes the division between normal and abnormal, evaluates, judges, decides. Discourse of the schoolmaster, the judge, the doctor, the psychiatrist. This is then a shift. He's talking here about the role accorded to habit in shifting away from sovereign power to governmental power, in which governmental power depends upon forms of knowledge that operate power through the role that particular experts play in particular institutional contexts. Experts here, experts of normalization, who are the habit actors. And he follows these lines of inquiry up in his Discipline and Punished, published shortly after, and in his 1974-5 course of lectures on abnormal but in different ways. In Discipline and Punish, it's the disciplinary effects of habit understood as a mechanism of automatism that he stresses. I'm just going to let you read that. In Abnormal, by contrast, it's how habit operates within a historically specific regime of personhood that he stresses, the move away from the reference to sentiment and passions that informed Hume's account of habit to its place in a new regime of personhood governed by the biological and psychological sciences, where it is habits' relationships to instincts, drives, and inclinations that counts. He's talking here about thinking about habit in a shift away from one way of thinking about persons to entirely new ways of thinking about persons associated with the development of the biological and psychological sciences. This gels nicely with the approach we've been developing in the habit project that we're working on, in which we look at how habit operates as part of what we call architectures of the person that are proposed by the discourses, like the discourses of psychiatry and so on, psychology, of which they form a part. That is, how the operations of habit are conceived in relation to other aspects of personhood. Whether we think about habit as being like a reflex, is it like an instinct? What's its relationship to will? What's the relationship between habit and consciousness? What's the relationship between habit and the body and the mind? And the consequences this has for the role that acting on habits plays in governing practices. But we can't get at these questions properly unless we go beyond the negative conceptions of habit that inform the passages from Foucault I've looked at. So the point about this is I could go on and offer you other examples that are worked out in more detail. But you can see already from what I've said about Foucault here, the ways in which habit operates, if you like, as one of these transactional realities again. It's a way of connecting with conduct in order to work upon it, to govern it, to shape it, to transform the ways in which individuals behave and to transform the ways in which groups behave. And what I've tried to show here, very, very briefly, by way of what Foucault had to say at the end of one of his lectures on the subject of habit, is how we can see how habit was rethought in its move away from the philosophy of David Hume and the ways in which it functioned as a way of founding social contract theory, to the ways in which in 19th century discourses of normalizing conduct associated with the biological sciences and so on, it's brought to bear upon not the propertied classes, but upon the population as a whole, as a way of automating their conduct and governing them through forms of automation associated with the rise of factory discipline, for example. Okay? So habit's a shifting actor, depending upon which regime of knowledge it's put to play in, which context it's used, but it's always an actor that's brought to bear upon the governance of conduct. So I'll move to summarise. So what I've tried to do are a few things. First, to review the general aspects of Foucault's account of the relations between knowledge and power, to identify the kinds of intervention this account constituted into Marxist accounts of science-truth relationships, the science-truth-power polarity he took issue with, and to consider the influence that this has had on within cultural studies in providing an alternative to and critique of the Althusserian Gramscian formulations that were influential in its 1970s and 80s versions. I've sought to review Foucault's account of the historical variations in the organisation of knowledge-power relations, and to identify how his perspectives on the relationships between knowledge and power can be brought to bear on the role that cultural disciplines have played and continue to play in practices of governance, and to illustrate this with 3 case studies focused on the role of aesthetics in governmental rationalities informing mid-19th century public art gallery projects, various episodes in the governmental career of the anthropological concept of culture, and very briefly the role of habit in governing practices. In saying all of this, I'm not suggesting that adaptations of Foucault's knowledge-power perspectives for the purposes of cultural analysis exhaust all possible routes into the analysis of culture-society relations. They don't. But I do think they provide an indispensable means of engaging with many distinctive aspects of contemporary culture-society relations. To my mind, they pose an essential set of questions for interrogating the cultural disciplines. What truths distinguish such disciplines? How are they connected to specific apparatuses? How do these apparatuses work as technologies of subjectification? How are the relations between different knowledge systems in play in processes of governing, and how are these related to strategies for dividing populations and governing them differently? And I'll stop there. Thanks a lot. So, go for it.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I just wanted to explore perhaps, if it's possible, a critique of Foucault. I'm not sure whether these critiques have been made, but it seems to me that there's a certain passivity assumed in regard to the human subject, and I wonder if that's something that has been raised at all. And I'm also just wondering about the whether government is perceived as a monolithic and rational actor. So I just wanted to raise those 2 points.
I can see why you ask it, given my presentation, I think, the first one, but I don't think the passivity of the subject would work for Foucault, really, for a couple of reasons. One is something that I touched upon, but he makes a great deal of, he makes a great deal of the ways in which individuals are called into and are required to work upon themselves. The selves that they work upon are never pre-given, the individual's never pre-given, they're not sovereign in any ways. But he argues that we can't understand how persons are formed unless we look at the ways in which they are brought into processes of working upon and shaping themselves. And he constructs, as it were, various vectors of personhood through which different aspects of personhood work upon one another. I referred earlier, toward the end of my presentation, on architectures of the person. And you can see how this work upon the self might be set up as a work of the will upon taming and shaping the instincts. So he draws attention to this kind of like internal dialogues of personhood, but always seeing these as being set up by, operated upon, and we work upon ourselves through various kinds of like technologies. These technologies are not necessarily material, they're conceptual technologies. So one might look at the role that literature plays in producing various forms of work upon the self, reading the novel. There's a lot of literature written on the rise of the novel in terms of the formation of particular kinds of middle-class subjectivity. And that would be, Foucault isn't the only person to say that, but that would be an instance of what he has in mind. But of course, with regard to governance, no, it's not singular in its form. No, he's the one who stresses the multiplicity of different forms of governing and strategies for governing. And he was in his politics. He was, very much concerned to, in the particular areas of political action that involved him, to support the formation of counterconducts in which you take issue with particular forms of power. You mean departments of government? No. Well, when Foucault talks about governance, he's not just talking about government departments, and he's not talking about government. So that for him, governance is, in the cases in which I've sought to apply his work to my own interests, governance is something that's applied, it's something that's operated by a museum. It's something that's operated by a local community organisation. It's something that's operated by a whole series of apparatuses that are outside the state.
Thank you very much. So I have this kind of question about the difference between habit and Bourdieu's habitus. It's kind of, for me, I feel like there are a lot of things they share a little bit common regarding class, power, probably not so much about governmentality. So can you please share a little bit more on the difference between those two concepts? Thank you.
Okay, so that's a tricky one, but it's an important one. And to answer it properly, I'm going to have to say a little bit about the bit of the lecture I cut out. I'll talk about three things: habitus, habits, and habit. I'll talk about habits and habitus. Habit and habits first, and then habitus. And the reason they're important to difference, it's what I was going to go on to talk about. And I'm going to look up a quote from Deleuze. By habits, usually we're referring to things that are particular forms of repetitive conduct, all right? Particular routines, particular customs, and so on. That's what we mean by habits. Habit, and the bit I cut out of my talk was saying we needed to go, to understand how habit operates, we need to go beyond the largely negative definition that Foucault was working with in the bits of his work that I summarised. I'm sure he's aware of the points that I'm going to go on to make. Because there is a much more positive tradition of habit that derives from the work of St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, and that runs right the way through to Bruno Latour in the 21st century, with a few interesting kind of stop-offs in between, obviously, in which habit is referred to more positively. And the way in which it's referred to more positively is nicely summarised by Gilles Deleuze, who said, in a book he wrote on Hume, he said, "We are habit, nothing but habits." But then he goes on to say, "We are the habit of acquiring habits." Now, what's important there about the differences is that habit there is a mechanism for changing habits, okay? And in many traditions of thought, habit is something that's, this capacity to change habits is something that only some kinds of people have and others don't. It operates a division within populations. It was a source of a way of thinking about the differences between white white settlers, and indigenous Australians at one point in time, under the influence of 19th century anthropology. So habit then is a mechanism for changing habits. So when Bourdieu writes about habitus, he does from time to time, he says, no, habitus is not the same thing as habits. For him, rather, habitus is a kind of a particular constellation of forms of conduct that have come to be more or less routinized, that make up a particular set of integrated dispositions that will be related to distinctive social positions, like a class or a group. or whatever. So these are three concepts that play an intricate game of kind of like hide and seek with one another, or tag with one another in social theory. But it's really useful to keep them distinct in your mind if you can, but it's tricky.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little about, because I saw that you moved between Foucault's earlier work and then you referenced care of the self and, you know, the stuff around technologies of the self and whatnot. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about that. And the reason I ask that is because I'm drawing on Foucault in terms of kind of informing some actual practices of agency and how that might actually look. So the earlier work is kind of has its limits. Specifically, I guess when you were talking about the first example that you provided from your book, I felt, I mean, my reading of that was that there were some synergies with the kind of subjectivity that Foucault talks about within the ancient Greeks, you know, things about, you know, the role of art, self-reflection, but he talks about that as actually a positive thing, as in a cultivation of the self. And so I guess the question is really, the question that, you know, feminist scholarship keeps coming back to is, which is something that was not, you know, well fleshed out by Foucault, how do we draw the line, or when do we know when something is a technology of the self, or where that seeps into a technology of, you know, dominance and power? Because we need a good framework around that in order to move forward.
I think it's certainly true that there is that development in Foucault's work away from what we're seen as kind of like, you know, we just receive power and it works upon us. And in opposition to that, he did in a variety of his later writings seek to emphasize the ways in which we are able to, when we do, work upon ourselves, both as the vehicles through which particular forms of power operate upon us and construct us and mobilize us, but we also do so by ways of taking issue with them and resisting them and reshaping them. And I'm not sure, because I've not thought about this for quite some time, I'm not sure whether there is or whether we need to look for a difference of a fundamental kind. We need to look for differences of a political kind between the ways in which those kinds of, to work upon yourself, to cultivate the self in a way that's linked to an oppositional practice, you have to uncouple, you have to deconstruct the ways of working upon you that are associated with dominant forms of power. So that's an intricate process of reworking the self. Is this making sense? Yeah. All right. So I mean, you have to acknowledge that there are a set of processes that are institutionally mediated, that are superintended by particular forms of expertise that have produced the you that is you, or the me that is me. And then it's not that there is, as it were, an authentic pre-given source of resistance that wells up to overcast those. There has to be a process of unpicking them and of restitching, remaking the self in ways that point one in new political directions and point one in one's relationships to others in new political directions. So I don't think you can't really do this unless you acknowledge the ways in which you have been worked, all right, and are then open through different communities, through different mechanisms, through different relationships. You're open to ways of reworking yourself. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, that just really proves the limits of Foucault's work, really. Even that idea of power and resistance as a kind of binary. I mean, when we think about what feminist scholarship has afforded in that space, it's things like, well, where does things like strategic compliance fit within that dichotomy, So, yeah, I don't know.
Well, I think you're more aware of feminist debates than I am, but don't forget, I mean, he died in 1980s. So I mean, I do think that his work has obviously had a significant influence upon feminist scholarship, but it would be exceedingly surprising if it stopped there and hadn't gone on, to open up new territories and so on and so forth. But I think what I disagree with in what you're suggesting is that I don't think that he didn't operate with a theory of subjection in which we are just enthralled to power. That is one way of reading parts of his oeuvre, but there are other aspects of his work that point in different directions, and which I think that have informed many different kinds of critical movements.
No, I agree with that, by the way.
Thanks, Tony. You pointed to the typologies of power and also just noting he did die in 1980. I'm thinking if he were alive today and living in Australia in this federal election campaign, what kind of combination of power, like there's obviously an evolution in his thinking, the way he is understanding the movement and the kind of ecologies of power. Today, where do you think he would put the drivers of power in Australia? I'm thinking governmentality and bio power.
No, indeed. I'm just trying to think. I'm trying to think outside the particular election context. No, it's a very interesting question, and I'm trying to think how I would answer it. No idea how Foucault would answer. My guess is what he would say would be. Is you need to differentiate the terrains of analysis in order to identify what kinds of power that you wanted to talk about. He would certainly, I think, so far as questions of, he would invoke notions of biopower in terms of the operation of indigenous, non-indigenous relationships. I think for sure those would be an aspect of power relations that he'd want to talk to. I don't know whether, I can't recall anything of what I've read about Foucault, whether he has much to say about migrations, mobilities, transnationalism. I just can't recall off the top of my head whether that's something that he is engaged with. I don't think, in Foucault, in writing about power, it was never of interest to him, but I don't think he ever would have denied the power of capital. To say that it's not the sole source of power doesn't mean it's not a source of power. It's simply not something that operated his attention. He would be extremely interested, I think, in the forms that gender politics have taken in Australia, and obviously he would invoke a critical perspective in relationship to the current forms of the governance of sexualities in Australia. I mean, he'd probably be cheered compared to the 1980s, but still many issues to be engaged with. Probably what he would think might be most distinctive in the political complex internationally now compared to the 1980s would be issues around environmentalism, I think, and the different sorts of disciplines and forms of governance that are involved in now the governance of exceedingly complicated human environment interrelations and their political implications. But I'm sorry, it's just thinking off the top of my head. It's a very interesting question. But he wouldn't have voted Liberal.
Okay, on that note, I think we might conclude. So thank